Hello and welcome back to another update of the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, the Russians have managed to advance further within the Kursk region and are now fighting within Sudzha itself. The Russians have also managed to advance east of Pokrovsk. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have managed to gain control over the entire pocket of Ivashkovsky, Yushny, and Bogdanovka, where they're now fighting over Kasachka Luknia, here to the south of this pocket, which was created by the Russian advances over the past few days. What happened was, following the Russian advance through Marchinovka and the capture of the town to then reach Sudzha, linking up with the tunnel folks, we see that the Russians managed to push upwards along the railway. This was pushed all the way towards Yushny. This cut off the Ukrainian forces both within the area here to the east of Ivashkovsky and Ivashkovsky itself, as well as the forest patch here in between Pravda and Yushny. These forces were completely encircled by the Russian push combined from the northwest through Luknia and Malaya Luknia and through the southeast through Sudzha, and this forced the Ukrainian forces to give up. Some of them surrendered without a fight, while others stood their ground till the last man. Now the Russians, with the capture of Ivashkovsky and Yushny, moved on to Bogdanovka, and now fighting has reached Kasachka Luknia, which is the town in which the Ukrainian forces who withdrew from Malaya Luknia and Luknia withdrew to. The remaining Ukrainian forces are now centered around Kasachka Luknia, as well as the Sudzha agglomeration of towns and villages. This means a heavy fight is taking place over Kasachka Luknia, which will determine the outcome of the entire area to the northwest of Sudzha, following which the fighting is also heavily taking place along the eastern bank of the river line, where the Russians, following the capture of Makhnovka, connected up with the forces further north through the capture of Kolmakov, and then moved onwards to connect with the forces south by Marchinovka with the capture of Agronom, and a push through the railways reached Bondarevka to capture the town as well. This forced the Ukrainians to withdraw from the Sudzha airport and Mirny, which followed with a Russian capture of both of these locations as well. And with this, all of the fighting to the east and south of Sudzha has ended, and the battle over Sudzha itself has begun. The fighting right now is centered around Sudzha itself. We see that the Russians have reached the outskirts of Sudzha from the eastern and southern directions. At the same time, they've managed to bypass Sudzha on the western and southern flanks completely to reach the supply lines of the Ukrainians in and out of Sudzha. And with the fire control over the supply line, the Ukrainians are unable to send significant reinforcements or supplies to Sudzha without encountering heavy losses. Therefore, the Ukrainians are now stuck in an area where they have to either withdraw from Sudzha and give up their Kursk incursion, which is doomed to end with the current siege of Sudzha, or to stand their ground until the end and fight without falling back. In either case, it is reported that the 47th Mechanized Brigade has left as one of the first brigades out of the Kursk region. The Russians have captured a Abrams tank, which was abandoned due to damage done to it. The Russians are now sending it back to the rear. I believe this is the second or third Abrams tank that they have captured. The Russians with this are moving onwards to the final battle over the Kursk region, following which the battle will enter the Sumy region. So we're seeing the real endgame of the Kursk incursion, and that is the battle over Sudzha itself. The fighting will likely focus around the southern and northern flanks, as the Russians will make use of the highway directly towards Sudzha to bypass the river line in the eastern parts of the town, and to make use of their supply hub in the town of Koronevo. I had to zoom out even further because I forgot how far back it was. The Ukrainians are down to less than 20% of the peak of the territory they captured in the Kursk region. To imagine that one day they were all the way over at Koronevo fighting over the town. And as I predicted back then, the Battle of Koronevo would determine the outcome of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Without capturing it, they would be doomed to rely on Sudzha, and with this very long supply line, it was only a matter of time until they lost control of the areas. But with this, we see that the Russians have managed to capture over 200 square kilometers in just 2 days, in 48 hours, the Russians have managed to capture over 200 square kilometers, with this recent advance being over 60 square kilometers. In a very Syrsky-like fashion, Syrsky has said that there is no danger of encirclement of the Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region, and he also stated that there is a withdrawal to better defensible positions. This reminds me of his famous statement that Bakhmut was semi-encircled back when Wagner captured the town and the Ukrainians decided to counterattack to then free up their forces during a withdrawal. He claimed that a semi-encirclement of Bakhmut took place when the Ukrainians controlled about this area here. What does the end of the battle in the Kursk region mean for both sides? For the Ukrainians, it means that an area in which a lot of Ukrainian resources were sent to gain some sort of upper hand against the Russians would end. We see that Ukrainian soldiers on the front line in the eastern and southern sections of the front line in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions were complaining about how many resources were redirected, how many soldiers were redirected to the Kursk region instead of the front line where heavy fighting was taking place. And now we see that this Kursk incursion, which has now lasted 8 months, is nearing its end with no reasonable results for Ukraine. Ukrainian argument was an exchange of territory between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians would give back what they took of the Kursk region in exchange for other territory elsewhere. But now that the Russians are about to capture the remains of the Kursk region, the Ukrainians would lose that card, and it would truly be, as Trump said in his meeting with Zelensky, Zelensky has no cards in this negotiation at all if the Kursk region returns into Russian hands. And with this, we see that in terms of morale, it is a disaster. In terms of equipment and manpower lost, it is a disaster. In terms of end result, it is a disaster. And the Kursk incursion turned out to be a complete disaster despite the tactical prowess they showed on the first days of the offensive, capturing hundreds of square kilometers of territory. They ended up not being able to make use of what they had captured. In the southern section of the front line, to the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to advance into the town of Tarasivka, where they've managed to advance from the town of Zelenopole, which they captured a couple of months ago. With this, the Russians have managed to enter yet another town and are flanking the counterattack of the Ukrainians that took place from Tarasivka. The objective of the Russians to advance further along the river line here to the north and to cut off this counterattack. You'll see fighting continues in the southern section of the front line, but the main focus is in the Kursk region, so there are not many reports from other sections of the front line. Deep State Map claimed some counterattacks took place here in the direction of Sinkivka, but they also claimed that the Ukrainians always held control over parts of Sinkivka and never lost control over the town. They also claimed that the Russians were not inside Petropavlivka, despite geolocated footage saying otherwise. Therefore, I'll wait for further confirmation instead of editing the front line according to their whims. At the same time, we also see that Ukraine will be meeting the United States in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky arrived today in Saudi Arabia. He's yet to meet the United States. That will be in a couple of days. Today, he is meeting the Saudi Crown Prince. In this deal, according to this Reuters article, the US has multiple goals. One of them is for the minerals deal to be signed, and another part is for a ceasefire to be enacted. In addition to the minerals deal, the Americans now also want to sign an additional deal, which is a fossil fuel deal on gas, natural gas, and oils, and so on. Energy to be a similar deal to the minerals deal. So we see that the Americans are really getting, I believe, greedy in this, whereas Zelensky was already refusing. And now that he may be turning around to agree to some of these terms Trump has laid out, they start adding additional terms, and this makes it difficult for Zelensky to simply agree. But in this case, Zelensky should just agree at this point, because if it continues down this road, either he will never get back any additional aid from the United States or the intelligence, which we have seen has had fatal consequences for the Ukrainians already within just a few days. but there will be additional terms on top of the already tough terms that is being set on Ukraine. And to understand Trump's perspective on this, his perspective is the United States has no reason to support Ukraine. The fact that they have is a detriment to the United States. That is his perspective. Therefore, he wants to make up for it. He has given a lot of money to Ukraine. He's given military aid and much more else, intelligence, everything that Ukraine has used to fight this war for now entering its 4th year. Yet, the United States has not received anything in return. That is his perspective. So when Zelensky goes up to him in the White House and says he needs additional stuff, he starts making terms, and he acts in this way he has acted towards the Joe Biden administration and the European countries who have given him everything he wanted because they saw a lot of benefits in it besides the perspective of Trump. It doesn't work well. It is a fatal mistake in the negotiations to believe that Trump will just go along with the desires of Ukraine, because Trump simply does not share that same perspective. And this has led to the humiliation which happened in the White House and subsequent consequences which have taken place since. And we see that although it is not clear, I believe one of the reasons why the Russians have been so successful with the Kursk counterattack is actually due to the lack of US intelligence being shared. If there was a gap, then the Russians were able to concentrate forces, they were able to create a strike group and so on without the Ukrainians detecting them, just because they were outside Ukrainian intelligence range, and this would have allowed them to gather enough troops to launch this offensive at a quick pace and just run it up quickly. We know that the pipeline they had to go through for 4 days. This means that this operation started about a day after the intelligence was stopped sharing, and this means that it could have a relation to that. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.